name's Andre, being joined by Ryan. Folks, as you know, we've been covering the Russia-Ukraine war for the past few days, and we've certainly heard a lot of news coverage on the conventional war so far. We've heard a little bit about those implicit nuclear threats that have been levied by President Vladimir Putin, but certainly cyber warfare plays a big role in what we're seeing. We've seen some news stories on it, but certainly it's not being as covered. But we do know Russia is a very prominent cyber actor. So we really wanted to dissect the cyber warfare in the context of Russia, Ukraine, and the United States, of course. So we are being joined by former NSA director and former US commander of the US Cyber Forces, Admiral Mike Rogers. Admiral Rogers served in those positions between 2014 and 2018 and had a 37-year career in the US Navy. Admiral Rogers was also one of our first guests on the Burn Bag podcast in summer 2020. We really appreciated his support then, and we certainly appreciate his support now and his willingness to come and join us on such short notice. So Admiral Rogers, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
Oh, very good. Andre, please call me Mike, and please, I love the work that the Burn Bag podcast is doing, and I'm honored to be a part of it.
Sure thing. So I guess, what are your first reactions to the Russia-Ukraine conflict? What are your gut reactions so far?
So first, I think people are surprised that perhaps the cyber and the disinformation piece was not quite as aggressive up front as I think many people thought. My sense is personally that was because Putin felt that he could achieve his objectives in the Ukraine without a significant cyber element. Plus, I think his view was he wanted to keep this focus very confined to the Ukraine, didn't want to escalate it. It's interesting now we're, depending on what metric you want to use, we're 4 or 5 days into this now. I think clearly he is behind timeline now in terms of his physical ground operation in the Ukraine. He has failed to achieve the territory acquisition objectives that he had hoped for. So I take two things from that. Number one, you're going to see him double down on more capacity, more force. It's going to get a lot messier. You'll see him use firepower much more aggressively. Infrastructure, I don't think he's going to care about damage. And he's going to throw more forces. And you can already see, commercial imagery is showing he's got more Belarusian and Russian forces coming in along multiple axes. So that's going to play out. The second component of this to me is because he is behind timeline, because he underestimated both the capacity as well as the determination and, quite frankly, courage of the Ukrainians in physically contesting his invasion on the ground. I think, and the fact that the sanctions clearly, I think, have been much more far-ranging than he had thought, have had a much greater impact. I mean, look, the ruble's already devaluated by 30% in a day. They could not open their financial exchanges today because they were concerned of meltdown, so they've locked them down to preclude any significant commercial activities. You look at the lines of people in banks today in Russia who are trying to pull their money out and hopefully convert it into a different currency besides the ruble, because the ruble has become so devaluated. You look at the protests that have erupted in Russia, and I'm not going to argue they're massive, but he's got people demonstrating, on the streets in major urban areas. And quite frankly, I don't think he expected any of that to happen. So given all that, I think one of the implications that I am looking for is, I think he's trying to figure out what are the tools I have to potentially put more pressure on the West to back off. I think you saw the first card play out in the last 24 hours where he talked about putting his nuclear and strategic deterrent forces on higher alert. I think that was designed to remind the West, look, I've got a broad set of capabilities here, and you need to be mindful of that. You don't want this to get out of control. But I also think he's going to be looking at cyber and the disinformation pieces much more aggressively in the coming days and weeks. I really think you're going to see him start to turn to them now, because quite frankly, he has got to find a way to put pressure on the US and the broader alliance, NATO, EU, and other nations. I mean, if you're sitting in Berlin today, you have had the Germans announce that they are going to inject $100 billion into defense spending in this year alone, that they are immediately going to go to the 0% of GDP level that the Germans have been trying to get to for 8 years since 2014. And you've seen Switzerland, for example, acknowledge that they are going to impose sanctions. And don't think that the oligarchs are thinking about, I put a lot of my money in Switzerland. And now, in part because I always thought they would be neutral and stay out. Now I look at a Switzerland that they are indicating, hey, look, this conduct is so egregious, the Russian invasion, so beyond the norms and the rule of law. The Swiss are indicating, look, we won't support this. And in fact, we are prepared to take steps designed to impose pain as a view to get you to back off, to leave the Ukraine. So I think, Putin is trying to figure out, what tools do I have to potentially create pressure in the West to get them to back off? What tools do I have to potentially energize the domestic populations in the US and in the sanctioned nations to protest and impose, argue with their own governments, hey, look, the price of this isn't worth it for us. We should back off. It'll be really interesting to watch how this unfolds in the coming weeks and days.
So, Mike, let's go ahead and talk about the tools that Putin has at his disposal, and in particular, the cyber tools, because Russia, as Andrei kind of set up at the top, has used cyber tools, cyber weapons for years against a variety of actors, Ukraine particularly, for the better half of like a decade, but also against the United States. And so before we talk about what might be used against Ukraine, what are the tools at Putin's disposal, and how could the Russian military react from the cyber front?
So let's first look at the kinds of activity we have seen historically out of the Russians with respect to cyber. We have seen them use denial of service techniques to preclude the effective operation of websites, to preclude people's ability to access networks, information, data, money, their financial structure. We have seen them use cyber as a tool to attempt to cause pain within the economy. You look at NotPetya, you look at some of the events. We've seen 3 major sequences of cyber events play out in the Ukraine that we believe originated from the Russians in the course of the last 5 weeks. The Russians targeted Ukrainian government websites, military websites, banks, denial of service, ransomware. You have seen criminal groups use ransomware against economic targets in the West as a way to generate revenue. You have seen the Russians use cyber as a tool historically to penetrate critical infrastructure in the United States, to study it, to map it, if you will, with a view that potentially they might choose to put it at risk in some form of crisis or confrontation. So they have shown a pretty broad set of capabilities historically. They've also shown a willingness to engage in activities that, quite frankly, look at NotPetya, for example. The target was theoretically systems within the Ukraine, but because they used a supply chain attack that, quite frankly, opened it up to a much broader set of users well outside the Ukraine, they ended up triggering a global impact. So they have shown a willingness to, quite frankly, not necessarily be very precise or targeted in their cyber acts. As I look to the future, what is in the realm of possibility, it is all those things, but I would also argue you would see them, I believe, also looking at in the coming days, can we use cyber as a tool to degrade or destroy or deny access to functionality? So it's interesting. You've seen criminal actors penetrate systems, upload malware designed to encrypt or lock down their data and some of their OT infrastructure with the purpose of generating revenue. What if the Russians now decide we're going to penetrate networks, we're going to upload malware, we're going to lock down data, operating technology, infrastructure, industrial control systems, and we don't care about ransom. We're not doing this for money. We're doing this to create a measure of pain with a view that this will lead to a political calculation that perhaps the price of these sanctions is higher than the West thinks they are. So I just look for a application of cyber with not only what we've seen, but perhaps with additional focus on Can I degrade or deny functionality in the West? Can I potentially destroy or damage some parts of infrastructure? Now, having said all that, remember, I don't think anyone, Russia, the United States, the West as a whole, I don't think anyone wants to get into a war in cyber. And so I believe that there will still, at least initially, be a desire, if I look at it from a Russian perspective, I want to use cyber as a way to create pain, to create political impact, to potentially change the calculation of the price that the West is going to have to pay, to get me to leave the Ukraine. But I think that I hope, and I believe at least initially the Russians were also thinking, but on the other hand, I don't want to trigger a cyber war. And I think you're definitely going to see that from a US and a Western perspective. Look, the US is assessing right now, what are its options in cyber? Clearly, the focus will be on the defensive side. But I think it's also fair to say, if I was in my old jobs, I would be talking to the senior leadership of our nation about, if we had to, what, kind of offensive or effects-based operations could we use in cyber as a way to send a broader political message to the Russians, as a way to remind them that the US has more capabilities than just the economic tools that it has chosen to use so far.
So when we talk about not wanting a war in cyber, I think certainly we'd want to sort of evaluate what exactly a war in cyber would look like. So of course, there's certainly critical infrastructure attacks and so on. But one question I want to ask before that is that I guess a lot of us in the government of the United States, perhaps in the government of Ukraine, there's a lot of reliance on contractors, non-governmental companies, and so on. I mean, certainly supply chains are one of the biggest side channels of attacks that may exist. What potential for cyber attacks is there that could certainly cripple those supply chains that would sort of help bolster national security, not only in the United States, but in Ukraine more immediately?
So when you're looking at executing offensive cyber operations or effect-based operations, as we often would refer to them in the US within the DoD, you're looking at the target itself. So you're assessing and you're looking at the target broadly from three perspectives. The first, you're trying to understand the nature of the network structure, its cybersecurity features, and how you might bypass them. Secondly, you're looking at the human dimension of all of this. Who has access to this network, and who can I access or potentially impact that might give me a way to then access the target network? The third, to your point, is, so what's the supply chain? What are the affiliated contractors and external entities that also have access to my primary target network structure? And can I manipulate or go after them and then have an effect, if you will, against the primary target? So you're always trying to look at it as a series of very interconnected ecosystems, and there's multiple ways to impact the primary target. It doesn't always have to be directly. And so I would fully expect that the Russians are considering that. You've already seen some reporting. I've seen some reporting about Toyota and some potential suppliers already, for example, looking at potential cyber activity directed against some of their suppliers. Again, it's a first report, so we'll have to see. But I definitely think those are among the kinds of tools as the Russians are thinking about how do they want to actually apply their cyber capabilities. They will look at it much more broadly. Like I said, they'll look at it as a series of interconnected ecosystems as they're trying to choose targets and the ways that they want to manipulate or affect those targets.
So when we talk about targets, and Andre set this up, critical infrastructure is quite terrifying because that could lead to mass civilian death, because critical infrastructure not only is crucial for the military and the government to operate, but certainly to keep countries afloat. That's why they're called critical infrastructures. But I think for the benefit of for those listening, could you kind of walk us through what is considered critical infrastructure, why critical infrastructure is so important, and why it could be a target by the Russian military? But also, when we flip it around, how can the Ukrainian government and military protect critical infrastructure, not only alone, but also with maybe NATO or other allied assistance?
So the government has defined 17 segments in the private sector as, quote, critical infrastructure. And generally, we use the definition, critical infrastructure is that portion of the private sector in which if we were to receive significant degradation, significant destruction, significant impediment of operations through cyber, in this case, we're talking about the cyber prison as the vehicle to affect this critical infrastructure, the impact would have significant economic, national security, or safety and well-being impacts on the United States. That generally was the broad definition that we used to both identify and define critical infrastructure. So in those 17 segments, think about healthcare, think about energy, just think about the electrical power grid, think about energy pipeline transportation, think about the financial sector, think about the election sector, think about the financial infrastructure of the nation. Again, think about the impact we would have if those were significantly degraded or our access to those services were denied. Again, what I think critical infrastructure is an attractive target. Now, one of the questions gets to be, so what is the impact you want? Are you talking about outright destruction? Are you talking about some period of degradation or denial? Again, you need to be very specific here because, we're either Russians, for example. I would be a little concerned about what the Americans might do. For example, if I decided, I'm going to try to take down, I'm going to try to destroy through the use of software, I'm going to try to destroy the power grid in the United States. On the other hand, I think they might say to themselves, well, what if I was able to degrade it in high population concentrations? And I, for example, was able to shut down power for small periods of time, just to remind the Americans, I could do more if I wanted to. And also with a view to the American public, there's a price that you as an individual are going to pay for the actions of your government. Are you sure that you're comfortable with that price? Perhaps maybe you want to put pressure on your government to say, I fully support the Ukrainians and I think what the Russians have done is terrible. On the other hand, I don't want to lose my power over it. Perhaps do we need to back off? Those are the kinds of things that, again, if you're a policy individual in a nation that you tend to think about within the realm of the possible. From a US perspective, we were always mindful. Whatever we did, it had to be very precise. Well, I remember when NotPetya occurred, I thought to myself, if that had occurred when I was in my 2 old jobs, we would have had authority stripped away from us and I would be looking for new jobs. I wouldn't be, I would have been fired because we would have never done an operation in which we felt that there was a high potential for that kind of impact. So in the US, we always try to be very measured, very precise, and we're always concerned about potential for escalation. So we always think about that as we're trying to figure out what's the range of options we should consider with respect to cyber. You mentioned the defensive side of cyber. Look, we have been working with the Ukrainians for some time. That started when I was at Cyber Command, for example. It continues today, and they've taken it up to a whole nother level. We, as well as the broader NATO alliance, we're trying to provide knowledge, expertise. We're trying to help the Ukrainians strengthen the cybersecurity of their networks and operating systems. We were trying to help them understand resilience and how you could create a more resilient structure, processes, and culture, if you will, with respect to cybersecurity. Those continue. It was interesting in the immediate aftermath of in this buildup to what ultimately became the Russian invasion. You saw several times the US and other nations talking about how we were going to provide and are providing increased cybersecurity capacity and capability to the Ukrainians. The focus has been on sanctions in the last several days, but getting less attention, but still a visible, very significant part of the US and NATO and the EU strategy is to ensure both the Ukraine as well as the US and the alliance is working hard to increase their resilience, to increase the level of cybersecurity resident within our systems.
So you do bring up many good points, especially about that fear of escalation, because retaliation in the cyber domain has been discussed quite extensively, and I guess there's not too much consensus on what proper retaliation would look like for certain stages and levels of attacks. And certainly with regards to NATO, I mean, last year, NATO actually broadened Article 5 in terms of cyber, and the NATO Secretary General recently said that cyber attacks could in fact actually trigger Article 5, an attack on one being an attack on all.
Right.
So I guess additionally, we just saw a cyber attack on NVIDIA, actually the tech company, which is a US-based company. What would proportionate retaliation in this domain look like during wartime? And I guess, what are your thoughts on the whole NATO situation with regards to, because that'd be massive escalation. Right. And is an attack on that private company like NVIDIA, would that constitute a need for retaliation?
So a lot of questions here. So first, I would argue the alliance has indicated that cyber, as you said, potentially meets the threshold for triggering Article 5, the mutual self-defense, and attack against one as an attack against all. But the alliance has also said that determination will be made based on the specifics of an event or activities. So there's no predetermined, well, if you hit this threshold, you have this amount of monetary damage, this kind of specific target. The alliance has always said, as has the US, look, we will look at each situation on a case-by-case basis and make a specific determination. The second point I would make is, remember, a response to a cyber event does not necessarily have to be cyber in priority or focus. You know, a lot of times I and others, when I was in government, would argue, look, as we're looking at how are we going to respond to cyber events of concern, we need to remember that we want to consider the full range of capabilities that we enjoy as a nation. Not just cyber, but the economic capabilities we have, the informational, the political, the military kinds of capacities and capabilities we have. Look, just because they come at us in cyber doesn't mean we have to knee-jerk and automatically respond. Secondly, you're also thinking to yourself, okay, let's say they went after, in this case, let's assume, and it is an assumption, so we got to wait and see over time if it proves to be accurate or factually correct. Let's assume we see them going, the Russians using cyber against Western companies. A lot of the times, then we start to ask questions, okay, what was the impact? What was the nature of the target or effect? Was this a temporary disruption? Was this physical disruption? Was this against a private sector entity that has potential life and death implications for our citizens? You know, it's a healthcare provider in the middle of a pandemic. It's associated with power. Hey, we don't want to lose power to our hospitals, healthcare, emergency service, etc. So we'll look at it on a case-by-case basis. I just always remind people, look, I know we love to talk in broad, really simple things. Cyber is just not, it doesn't lend itself well to that.
So I'm kind of curious about the role of non-state actors here, because while we have Russia and Ukraine and all the other related countries like the US and NATO countries, cyber is not only employed by state actors. There's a lot of non-state actors, individuals, groups. And so I've been kind of tracking the work of Anonymous recently and some other maybe pro-Ukrainian groups that are trying to do work and hacking basically for Ukraine. Of course, there are Russians doing the same thing, and Russian linked groups, whether they're paid or maybe they're pro-Russian, that are doing the same exact thing. And so how does this non-state actor kind of play in to a war like this? And is there a way in which, both from an offensive and defensive side, you can maybe silo it to kind of prevent the impact?
So first, I think that's one of the most interesting dimensions within cyber in the conflict we've seen to date. For the first time in a kinetic conflict, you are seeing the primary parties, Russia and the Ukraine, turn to third-party groups in cyber. Patriotic hackers, both the Ukraine has announced they are doing this, as well as the Russian. In addition, as you've said, you've seen third-party actors, in this case, Anonymous is a good example, who have decided that they feel strongly enough about what is going on that they want to use cyber as a tool to convey their disagreement, disapproval of the actions of one of the parties, in this case, the Russians. Never seen that before in the context of a conflict. So I really do believe in many ways the Ukraine crisis will prove to be a very historic and watershed event in the history of cyber and cyber warfare. You're really seeing some things play out for the first time that we haven't seen before. So as you're looking, given that third-party activity, and one other point, watch to see, particularly on the part of the Russians, if they start to look to use third-party surrogates, think about criminal groups in particular, as surrogates for the execution of cyber activities in this crisis against the US and the West, with a view that the Russians can then say, hey, you can't hold us accountable, we didn't do it. Watch how that plays out. Now, in terms of how do you react, can you try to silo it? This gets to be really challenging. The US, for example, has argued with the Russians for some periods of time, hey, look, the criminal actors within your sovereign state that are engaged in ransomware efforts against US and allied nations, both in terms of government infrastructure as well as predominantly private infrastructure, we think that's totally unacceptable. We believe you have a responsibility to help deal with it. What was the Russian response? We're not connected with it. You can't prove anything. Do you control all the crime in your country? You can't hold us accountable here. So it's interesting to me, the Russians rejected that concept that they should be held accountable in some ways for the actions of third parties who are acting against the US and Europe from their own sovereign territory. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out with this dynamic. So the idea of siloing this or stovepiping, I'm not sure that's going to work well. I just think the parties in general, at least offensively. Now, defensively, it's a little different kettle of fish, so to speak. There is not concerns generally, unless you really get into active defense and what's the difference between active defense and kind of offensive activities in cyber. But broadly, efforts to address or improve cybersecurity to increase cyber resilience, I don't think anybody's going to view those as escalatory. I don't think anybody is going to view, hey, actions within those arenas by private entities are somehow destabilizing. I don't see that. The offensive side, though, that could be another matter. We're going to have to see how that plays out.
So you mentioned earlier that the United States, during your leadership in NSA and CYBERCOM and under the current leadership, has been having partnerships with Ukraine on those cyber capabilities. NATO also said that they would provide support in terms of cyber to Ukraine. But I guess for a lot of our listeners, right, we hear cyber, 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 giving a country fighter jets or guns or grenades to our audience feels a lot more tangible than this abstract notion of cyber. So what actually, and obviously you can't tell us all the things, but what would those services, what would those products, what would those cyber weapons necessarily look like? Are we providing people? Are we providing?
And again, we're talking the defensive side, so don't use the phrase cyber weapons.
Sure.
What you're talking on the cybersecurity and cyber resilience piece is, for example, the deployment of small teams with monitoring capabilities, with extensive expertise. You send small teams forward, they partner with their Ukrainian counterparts, they take a look at specific networks, constructs, data concentrations, software tools currently being used, and they try to train also individuals in the techniques associated with cybersecurity and cyber resilience. In addition, you will often provide the Ukrainians with software tools designed to help them increase their situational awareness of their networks and what's going on. You'll provide them with tools that are designed to increase the security of their networks. You'll share information with them about, in this case, Russian actors, who they are, how they operate, what in the military we call their TTPs, their tactics, techniques, and procedures. Hey, here's how the Russians are actually going to work. Here's what their Viper malware is going to look like. This is the way they'll scan your networks. These are the things to look for as they penetrate. This is how they'll tend to move once they're in your network structure. You share those kinds of insights. That's what assistance in cyber looks like from a cybersecurity or cyber resilience standpoint. I would highlight, you have not seen any public description, nor would I think that we would likely do this, that the US or NATO would provide cyber offensive capability to the Ukrainians. I just don't see that happening. I mean, I'll only speak for the US, we have always opted to keep our offensive cyber capabilities on very tight control. And they are capacities or weapons that we ourselves would execute. We don't use third parties to do it, because we want to be very measured and very specific, and we want a level of control here. We understand that there are significant implications associated with the use of cyber weapons or cyber offensive capability. And as a result, while we might share ordnance, bombs, missiles, weapon systems with allies and friends, generally, you don't see that in offensive cyber. Now, that may change over time, but I don't see that changing right now.
So if we set aside for a moment the kind of offensive defensive aspect of this war and just kind of look to how the internet is playing a significant role, and I'd say almost as important as the actual more conventional parts of this conflict, Russia could very well attempt to completely shut off the internet in Ukraine. And that has a lot of different implications. Not only does that kind of limit communication, but it also has impacts on recording and reporting on what's occurring inside Ukraine as far as the conflict, right? How are things progressing? Where are Russian troops moving? All that stuff. I mean, open source information has been invaluable in this conflict. And so one, could Russia shut off the internet of Ukraine, right? Could they limit the ability of Ukrainians to post to social media, to text each other, for the Ukrainian military to communicate with one another? And if they do end up doing something like that, are there alternatives? I know that Elon Musk's and his Starlink satellite-based internet is a potential solution, but is that one that's actually a meaningful one? Could that be kind of taken down?
So the ability to cut or stop internet activity across an entire nation the size of the Ukraine is probably a challenge. But can you do that in specific locations and specific areas for specific or extended period of times? Yes. Now, you can do that multiple ways. You can use cyber and software tools to do it. Quite frankly, you can use a kinetic tool. If you decide you want to bomb the servers and the network switches associated with the internet structure in Kiev, for example, or a major population center, you can do that. The Russians are now in that kinetic environment. So I remind people, look, there's multiple ways to degrade internet structure or to deny its use, from very traditional kinetic to cyber and software kinds of capabilities. In addition, I remind people, look, the internet is a significant backbone for the flow of information and connectivity, but it's not the only one. There is Wi-Fi and the cellular component to all this. There is Satlink as an example. There are space-based satellite-borne capabilities that you can use. The challenge is those get to be hard to replicate on a national scale. And again, depending on the capacity of the network structure, suddenly if everybody starts shifting from their traditional fiber or land-based, internet connection to, hey, we're going to do everything, try to do everything on Wi-Fi, a lot of structures aren't really built for that. So there's a lot of trade-offs here.
So we talked about escalation earlier, and I sort of want to return to that because I guess throughout history, we've seen sort of three quote unquote revolutions, for the lack of a better word, in the types of warfare and how that type of warfare has played into strategy. I guess the Industrial Revolution played into the difference in warfighting strategy in the 19th and the 20th centuries. Certainly nuclear warfare. The presence of nuclear weapons has changed how military strategy has gone on. And now cyber warfare, cyber technology, cyber capabilities has certainly played into how we think about military strategy. And as we mentioned before, this conflict might be one of the first in which we're really seeing these cyber capabilities somewhat deployed. But I guess my question is, have we sort of seen the worst, I guess, in terms of cyber weapons, cyber capabilities?
So the short answer is no.
Okay.
It could get much worse. That's where the escalation piece. Generally, escalation is driven by, does the recipient of the action you choose, do they believe that that action places them at greater risk? Does it increase the level of uncertainty or instability for them? Because look, if you're Putin, you want a sense of stability, you want a sense of control, you don't want to see significant additional damage. So you're asking, when you see cyber actions, for example, but I would argue escalation really applies to any act. The calculus is, in doing this, am I increasing impact or pain to an unacceptable level? Am I increasing the risk or probability that the other side feels they have to respond? In executing this set of actions, whatever they are, do I lead the potential target to believe that now they're losing sight of what's going on? They don't understand, injecting more uncertainty. Those are the kinds of pressures when you think about what causes escalation, what causes people, not necessarily nations, to respond not necessarily in kind, but feel they have to reply at a stronger level, at a greater level of that inflicts more pain on the initiators. Those are the kinds of things that you think about. Now, the way that you'll see this play itself out, for example, the stated objective from the United States and NATO for the actions that have been taken to date is to force the Russians to withdraw their forces from the Ukraine, and to respect the sovereignty of the Ukrainian state. Even as NATO and the US have said, look, if you want to have a broader discussion about what security in your border areas looks like, what security in Eastern Europe looks like, we are willing to have those conversations. We're not going to have any pre-agreements going in. We're not going to place constraints. We are willing to talk and we are willing to listen. That doesn't mean we're going to agree, but we're willing to talk and willing to listen. It would be a very different scenario, for example, if we said to ourselves, you know what our objective here is? We are not only are going to restore Ukraine as a nation and drive the Russians out, but we're going to get into regime change. And the long-term political objective is that Putin is no longer, the head of the Russian nation. That would be a totally different set of things. Now, very important here, we have not ever said that. I don't think we've ever contemplated that. But one of the challenges you find in warfare is once the dragon is out, is loosened, it can be awful hard to control. And so we'll see how all this, in terms of escalation, in terms of long-term objectives. And it's interesting, for example, I love history. You saw this in some ways play out, for example, when Saddam Hussein in August of 1990 invaded Kuwait. Our stated political objective, and the one that we created this coalition around, was we will drive the Iraqi military out of Kuwait. We will restore the territorial integrity of Kuwait, and we will ensure that the Kuwaiti government is back in place. We did not say, and remember the discussion we had, we did not say at the time, we want to remove Saddam Hussein from power. We said, look, that's not the objective. That's not what we built this coalition around. That would be, too far. And quite frankly, we are concerned about the implications of, how that might escalate if we were to state that as an objective. So again, history tends to repeat itself. Watch how the discussion about objectives and desired end states, does that change? Does it stay the same? And I'm not arguing it should change. Don't get me wrong. That's not my point. But, once you start this thing, I think the Russians, and I think, if we're honest, even the West thought that, okay, if the Russians decide they're going to invade 3 to 5 days, and probably the Russians will have managed to exert physical control over most of the Ukrainian territory. Well, we're coming up on the 5-day point, and clearly the Russians are off timeline, off schedule. This did not work as well as they thought. And so, we'll see, how does this change their calculus? How does this potentially change their desired end state? Does this lead them to believe, for example, it was tough enough potentially to gain control if they're able to do that? Does this lead them to believe, the ability for us to actually leave a military force in place within Ukrainian territory for an extended period of time? Boy, if we've had this much fight just getting in, what are they going to do to us if we decide we're going to stay for an extended period? I mean, think about an insurgency that has both a very traditional kinetic component to it, the use of explosive, conventional weapons. But think about an insurgency that also look at the cyber capacities that the Ukraine has within not just its government, but within broadly its broader population. Think about what a cyber insurgency looks like. Again, that's one of the reasons why I say this situation, I think, is really going to be significant in the history of cyber warfare as we develop it, because it's really going to be one of the first times you are going to see cyber play out in so many different ways as not just a supporting element of this conflict, but potentially over time as an increasingly significant element of operation or activity or focus.
I'm also a lover of history, and something that you see time and time again is PSYOPs, psychological operations, informational warfare, which of course has changed over history and time. But in this conflict in particular, I think the use by both sides of information, of social media, of reporting, photos, videos, etc., that has, at least to me, had a significant impact. And
I apologize. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No. I'll stop the question. I'm very curious on your response to this, because we don't know what's true and what's not true, right? We only hear what we're getting from both sides, as well as whatever other countries or individuals are willing to report, as that could be for movements of individuals, could be for casualty numbers, could be for how successful the Ukrainians are in repelling the attack versus how successful the Russians are in taking certain areas. And so I guess the first part of this is the component of this conflict informational? Is there a huge informational warfare part of this? And two, what impact does that have on the broader conflict? And of course, speaking to kind of your experiences, does this have a meaningful or maybe determinative impact on wars?
So first of all, it has a significant component. Secondly, let me disagree a little bit, Ryan. There are ways to use technology to verify some fundamental facts as accurate and inaccurate. So for example, you look at the metadata of a report that's hosted that shows video in which the narrative is, and today massive numbers of buses, are moving Russian ethnic individuals out of the Donbass regions in the Ukraine because their lives are being threatened by Ukrainian citizens. Well, the metadata will show you the video was shot 2 days beforehand. So there are some technical things here that you can use to help determine the basic accuracy of some of the facts being presented, not everything necessarily. And you've seen that really come out. It is interesting to me. You're watching media organizations really bore into the metadata, kind of technical aspects of some information reporting via social media in a way, I don't remember, go back to the 2016 election, for example, where you saw the Russians use disinformation, social media, and other capabilities. I don't ever remember news reports about the metadata accuracy of what was being supposedly, revealed or shown in the social media reporting. So you've seen that as a significant change. You've seen both sides try to use information. In the case of the Russians, trying to build this narrative that what they are doing is purely reactionary, that it is in fact the United States and the Ukrainians and the Western allies who precipitated this crisis, that it was they who were in fact threatening the lives of Russian civilians, that in fact the Ukrainian, remember, they talked about denazification, they talked about Ukrainian genocide, just absolute lies. But they were trying to use information to build a narrative that played well for them domestically, and they, the Russians, thought perhaps might help them on the global stage with some of their key allies. Well, that clearly has not worked. Likewise, you've seen the West and the Ukraine try to use information as a way to refute or anticipate some of the disinformation aspects that the Russians might use. So in the United States, for example, you saw aggressive use of very classified intelligence released early to say, look, here's the exact kind of events we know the Russians are contemplating. These are the things you should be looking for. This is what they're talking about or contemplating internally. We've never done that at that kind of level or that kind of amount for that extended period of time before. I think it proved to be very effective. I hope we, and I say this as an intelligence guy who in my past at times, argued, let's just make sure we continue sources and methods. Having said that, I always believe, look, if we generated access, I'll only talk from a technical standpoint. It's a little different from my human teammates because there's a very real, visceral human dimension to this that can lead to the death of sources, their interrogation, their imprisonment, not just for them, but their families. SIGINT, the area I focused on, tended to be largely very technical in nature. And my argument with the team always internally was, guys, I don't want to lose access either. But remember, we're here to serve a greater set of outcomes at a national level. And if we lose access, I'm confident in our ability. It might take us a while. Look, if we've gained access, we lose it, we could potentially regain it again. Let's think about the broader strategic implications of what is the benefit of potentially disclosing some of this information, and do those benefits at a strategic level outweigh the very valid concerns about potential impact on sources and methods. I always said, as intelligence professionals, we got to acknowledge that that's part of the calculus. We should be comfortable. Now, we should be articulating to policymakers, so here are the implications from a sources and methods kind of perspective. Were we to lose this access? Were we to lose these kinds of insights? But in the end, hey, that's a policy decision, guys.
So my last question, revisiting the cyber aspect of this, what does cyber spillover look like, say, from this conflict, the potential for cyber spillover? FBI and CISA this past weekend just issued an alert that the malware that was released by Russia on Ukraine, or could be released by Russia on Ukraine, could spill over to certainly other countries and pose risks for the United States. Not to be a doom and gloomer, but could this potentially foreshadow a global cyber war?
I mean, could it? Yes. Do I think it's likely? No. Do I hope that happens? No. Because right now, and that could change, but right now I would argue the calculus of almost all the major players is, I want to see potentially how cyber might help me achieve my desired end state, but I also don't want to escalate because I don't want to lose control. I don't want this to become something broader. I don't want this to end up having economic second and third order impacts that go well beyond potential sanctions that are being used today with respect to trying to impact Russian activity. So it is possible. At the moment, I would say it is not, it certainly won't, I think, be the intended desire. There's always the unintended. And as I said, with respect to kinetic warfare, you always have to acknowledge, look, there's always a chance that once you actually execute something, it goes wrong and doesn't work exactly the way you want it to. NotPetya is a perfect example of that. The Russians executed a series of actions that they thought would have impact within the Ukraine and seemed to believe that any impact that's broader than that is likely to be pretty narrow, pretty small, and certainly acceptable. And then what happens? We get global impact. We have financial impact in terms of billions of dollars. You could see that on an even broader scale in all this. I certainly hope not. Again, it's another reason why the government is trying to argue right now. It's important we're focusing broadly as a society, as a nation, not just the government, but broadly the private sector, as well as the government. We need to be focused on cybersecurity. We need to be focused on cyber resilience right now. Let's put the work in right now so that if we see increased cyber activity, the malware you referenced as an example, were we to see that, let's make sure we're better positioned to try to minimize its impact. And if it were to have some level of impact, we want to make sure we've increased our ability to deal with it, to be resilient in the face of such activity.
And with that, Mike, I want to thank you very much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to have you on the podcast, and we really appreciate your insights and expertise, particularly for this issue. We'll see what happens with this conflict. I mean, this will certainly develop and change over time. But once again, thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Andre. You guys have a great day. And again, to your point, the last point I would make is we're all going to have to be watching this very, very closely. There's a high potential for miscalculation here. there's a high potential for escalation. I hope that measured minds and with those concerns at the forefront make smart choices. And we'll see how this plays out.